Welcome to the HR Dialogues, a show where we talk about HR and the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Dieter Veldsman, and today I'm being joined by Dr. Karen Britboard. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dieter. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Karen, to share with the members, we love to get to know our guests a little bit better. What brings you to the HR Dialogues today, and what makes you passionate about HR as a profession?
Such a great question. Well, what brings me to HR? HR was besides my babysitting job early in life, it was my first job and has always been a passion of mine. Obviously, human beings. As a psychologist, I've always been fascinated by human behavior, by human interactions, wanting to understand it, also wanting to understand how people change, how people grow. And so HR has been part of my entire career, even though I haven't always worked within HR because ultimately left HR for a period of time. And right now I'm in the talent space, which is very
Wonderful.
much connected to HR, but technically not in HR. But I grew up in HR. What can I say? So it's been a big part of my life and my purpose, my focus, really.
Karen, you also recently wrote a book, and I'll ask you some specific questions as we go through the conversation. But maybe what pushed you towards taking that big step and writing a book on relationship-based leadership?
That's such a good question. Well, actually, I had always, in the back of my mind, wanted to write a book. Then COVID happened, and I found myself having, less travel time in
Yes.
essence. But really, what prompted my decision to write the book was a conversation that I had with my, at the time, 8-year-old son, who's now 14, who basically said, Mama, I know you're a psychologist and you sit and you listen to people all day, but what do you actually do? Right. And that was his question to me. And it was a very good question. And I appreciated it. And I tried to explain to him what I did. And then I decided, you know what? I really want to write a book about this. Not so much to explain to him what I do, but rather to pass on the value in terms of what my value is, which is hugely about human connection, human relationships, how that is the basis of so much in our lives.
There's a line in your intro in the book that I absolutely loved where you talk about, but what is an organizational or work or industrial psychologist, and what is it that we actually do? And I think, we don't spend enough time actually explaining to people the breadth and the scope of the activities. So
Exactly.
that piece definitely resonated with me.
So the field is broad, and even the field of workplace psychology is broad. I have a friend who's a workplace psychologist who really spends time researching.
Mm,
Right, that's what he does mostly, and even though in my work there's always some part of research involved, because if we can't measure it, we really can't
yeah.
understand the effects of it to some degree. Um, I'm mostly, I would say, a practitioner,
Yeah.
is somebody that takes psychological concepts and applies them to the workplace. And that's been extremely rewarding, obviously.
No, most definitely. And I think that sets the tone so nicely, right, for what we want to talk about, which is really, and you've mentioned it already around, I think we are entering into a period of human connection and relationships becoming even more important in the workplace. And from my perspective, at least, I see a lot of people seeking authenticity, if I can almost call it that, and seeking that real, genuine connection. And I'd love us to unpack that theme a little bit around relationship-based leadership and why relationships are so important in the workplaces of today. But Karen, maybe as a starting point, when we talk about relationship-based leadership, what are we actually talking about, and what does that look like?
I call it the relationship driven leader, but it's really about strengthening connections. And
Mm,
true connections, by the way, aren't there if we're not truly authentic, right? So strengthening connections to really promote productivity and wellness at work, because we know, we've got science to back up the fact that when people feel psychologically safe, when they feel like they can be themselves and authentic, that it really does translate into creativity and innovation and productivity, right? But at the end of the day, wellness is a huge piece. If we don't have a well
mm,
workforce, we're not gonna do well. But a huge buffer, stress buffer, in essence, is having these sound relationships, people that we can
Yeah,
turn
of
to
course.
talk, to connect, right? And so a relationship driven leader is someone who's acutely tuned into the fact that human dynamics directly influence outcomes like decision making, collaboration,
Mm,
innovation, overall performance. But it's a big part of business strategy,
mm,
right? So, and it's also the right thing to do. It's all of the above. Yes, it's about productivity, but it's also about taking care of the human psyche and the human spirit. So it's
mm.
both and.
I think we are in a culture that celebrates different types of leadership behaviors. And I also firmly believe that human centeredness is becoming much more central to the role of how the leader connects with the work, with the followers, and in the organizations which they find themselves.
Beautifully stated. Couldn't agree more, right? I mean, but it's the how we approach work becomes
Mm,
just as relevant as the what we do.
yeah,
And this isn't necessarily taught in school, right? People who go get MBAs or different types of degrees to do what they do, accountants. It's not necessarily. It's either people are naturally good at it and it's
yeah.
it's what they value. But really, what my message is that we can all learn the skills to be more effective in our relationship. And that's the wonderful news about it, right? I always tell people that IQ stabilizes at about 16 years old, actually, right? The
Mm,
IQ. But EQ, which is these relationship skills that are so critical, they continue to build throughout one's life, and one could argue even get stronger
mm.
as we continue down the path of the career path, our own mortality path, right? It continues. Those types of skills can actually just get better.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, maybe something from my side in the HR domain, what's really interesting to see when we look at the data and what that tells us about the career of a chief people officer or a human resources executive is that a lot of the predictors and behaviors that get you there is not the things that make you successful within the role. And actually, a lot of the interpersonal relationship driven, the ability to manage dynamics, stakeholders, dealing with complexity, actually is a much better predictor of success at that level or at that layer. And I can definitely resonate with that when I think also in your coaching practice, when you speak to people that sit at those levels in organizations, they'll say it's these things that's helped me be successful. It's not necessarily the financial acumen or the business acumen that got me there, right?
Exactly. And actually, maybe it's what gets you to that role. But to your point, it's really at the end of the day, because when you get to be that executive leader, you're not necessarily in the trenches doing the work on a day to day. What
Mm,
you are is you're helping people do the work that they need to do. Sometimes it's by removing obstacles, right?
of
It's
course.
by helping them think through a problem in a different way. And even thinking through a problem in a different way doesn't necessarily mean having the expertise, but maybe it's the person is getting in their own way in terms of
Mm,
thinking of the problem. So as you rise up in an organization, certainly you may be managing people who are definitely better, have a better skill set to do what they do than you yourself from
yeah.
a subject matter perspective. And your job is to understand the whole, as well as helping that person potentially understand whether their dynamics that are getting in the way of the work getting done.
And that's a massive realization for leaders, right? I can remember sometimes my
Oh,
team, when I was in the CHRO role, used to ask me, "But what do you actually do? Because you just sit in meetings the whole day." And I said, "But remember, my role is to create a runway for you, so that you can do what you are supposed to. That is what I'm focusing on as part of that." Karen, I want to jump a little bit into the relationship driven leadership, and
yes,
you talk about
yes.
4 pillars. So help us understand, what are the 4 pillars that you've identified there?
Yes, yes. And I mean, I talk about a lot in the book, but I think that the pillars that you're talking about are the ones around connection and
Mm,
collaboration and appreciation and support. Those are 4 pillars that I've identified that I notice that I've noticed in my work, both as a psychologist, as an executive coach, as a colleague, are so critical for leaders to understand, but also have the skill set to actually do, because that's the other thing. People can understand it
of
intellectually
course.
because this is not rocket science, right? But the challenge is the implementation. what does actual personal connection look like? And you hit the nail on the head when you said authenticity, because that's really the heart of connection at the end of the day. Because how do you
Mm.
connect unless you're authentic, right? Collaboration. And sometimes people mistake cooperation for collaboration. They're
Oh, very
very
true.
different. They're very different. And then there's appreciation, right? Which is really the appreciating the human for who they are, right?
Mm.
Recognition tends to be more about what it is they've done,
Yeah.
right? So, wow, you've completed this assignment and you've done a fantastic job in that because of XYZ. That's recognition. Appreciation is really getting to the core of who the other is, and and being able to appreciate that person for who they are. And then support, and this is something that's so interesting, even in the field of, which is where my roots are as well. So my
Mm.
roots are in HR, but also in marital
Yeah.
psychotherapy, right? Is support. So what's been shown in some research in marital therapy is that partners who can actually support each other, both in the good as well as the bad, like both of them, when good
Mm.
things happen as well as when challenging happens. So support is not just when you're reaching out a hand to help someone when they are facing a difficult situation. Support is also when something amazing has happened to them,
Yeah.
really being
Gotcha.
able to recognize and saying, you know what, I'm so happy for you that this happened, right? And
Mm.
so there's this mindset around that you can really celebrate another person. That's support as well, right?
Yeah.
People don't always realize that. And so in some research that came out in marital therapy is a spouse that can say, I am so happy for you that this happened to you. Those are the relationships that we see really progress over time in a positive way, not just the ones that are, here, let me help you.
Yeah.
Let me help you during this difficult time.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important call out, right? Because I think the associations with the word support is usually, oh, I need to reach out. That person is going through a tough time, or this thing happened.
Exactly.
How are we going to be there to help you? And I sometimes find, and we'll get into it in a moment, but leadership is lonely, right? And I sometimes think leadership is
Oh,
more lonely when you're doing well because people then typically assume you are okay. I don't need to be with that individual, share their leadership journey or their leadership life with them. And I think when you talk about connection, I think we sometimes forget that connection goes both ways. As much as the leader needs to connect, I think there's also a need for to be connected for from a leadership point of view. And that's why I think communities and things are becoming even more relevant and important in that connection space.
absolutely. And I think that part of, a great leader is somebody who's resilient,
Yeah.
right? Who looks like they can weather the storm, and do it with grace and, equanimity, and just, and yet leaders are human beings at the end of the day. And that sometimes just because it looks like, right, we can hold it well, it doesn't mean that the bag isn't heavy,
Mm.
right?
Yeah,
And
of
so,
course.
uh, and so having those, I think, peer groups is incredibly important for leadership, to have people that you can turn to and share that it is hard. And
Mm.
yes, I came through it, but it's not, without a price sometimes, right?
Mm.
And I
Of
think that a
course.
lot of really great leaders have a mindset of servitude. Like, it's not easy being a leader, right?
Mm.
It's like I tell people, it's not easy being a parent,
Yeah.
right? There's a service component to all of it. And at the end of the day, I think that that service component is quite essential to being a great leader, that you're there for others and you've
Yeah.
taken on this responsibility. And there is a cost to leadership, and that's why it is so important for leaders to have sources of support.
There's two questions I usually ask, when working with new HR leaders or involved in these types of conversations. The first one I always ask is, why do you want to lead? Because I think we don't spend enough time to define what the picture of success looks like for you as the leader. And it's different for people, right? Some people do it for the responsibility I have, the impact I can make. For other people, it is a life of service, if I might call it that. And I think to
Yes.
clarify that piece is super important. And then the second one is, who are your people that's going to get you there? And I don't mean your direct reports. I mean your community that you're going to work with, that's going to share in your journey towards success. And I think we leaders don't self-reflect, I think, enough. And think specifically in the HR space, and it's similar in other professions, a lot of people kind of stumble into leadership or get pushed into leadership. And it's usually something that's been vacant or something that has to happen now. And then it's all about the task and the activities. So I want to almost ask you that question. Do leaders not reflect enough that these things, because you're right, it's not rocket science, but for some reason we don't convert it into practice?
Usually people get promoted into leadership roles because they're good at what they do, right?
Oh,
And
spot
then
on.
what ends up happening is they get to that leadership role and they realize, wait a second, I'm actually not doing the things that actually got me here,
Yep.
right? So my day is spent with other types of challenging problems that I wasn't dealing with. So this is like a completely different job, right? So I do think that even from an educational standpoint, we don't do enough around teaching people what it really means to lead. And
Mm,
that's in the workplace itself, but certainly in school throughout, one's path.
spot on.
And the thing that's put into highlight is the benefits of being a leader, right? It's maybe that great parking spot that you get that's right to the office, right? Or maybe you get a few more days of vacation, right? Or whatever it is. But people don't think, well, why are you getting these perks? You're getting these perks because you better get
Yeah.
into into the office quicker because you have
Yep.
the
There's
list
an
is
exchange
longer.
there.
There, bingo, Dieter. There is that exchange that happens. And at the end of the day, we're not setting up the organization for success or the person up for success to not understand what to be a leader really means. And so,
Yeah.
just like we have a mentorship and apprenticeships that happen, not formally or informally, right, for people to learn their craft, whatever it is,
Mm,
whatever that technical competency skill set is that they need to do their jobs, we don't necessarily, I think, do as good of a job. And I say that with all due respect for all the great programs that do
of
exist out
course.
there. But sending a person for a week-long program and how to be a leader is not the same as actually on a day-to-day over a period of time learning what it means to actually be a leader and to
Mm.
embody that role.
I agree, and I think there's a couple of mistakes that I see that people make. I think the first one is when you
Yeah.
step into the leadership role, you don't leave certain things behind. You know, the traditional theory of what do I leave behind when I shift or when I move, and I think that's becoming a lot more important, especially where organizational structures become a lot more unclear and a lot more fluid. I think that levels of work is becoming more and more important. I think the second one, to your point, is we don't manage the expectations of leaders well. We still have a very old traditional hero archetype in our minds when we think about leadership, and I think that sets people up for failure right from the get go. That sometimes leadership is not glamorous. You are not the person that comes in and saves the day. You are not the person that knows everything and crafts that strategic vision. And what's always interesting for me is when you speak to, in my mind, and we can debate what a success mean when I say a successful leader, it's very often these other elements that they talk about, right? To say they surrounded them with good people that knew more than they did at the time about the
Totally.
topic. They were able to connect them to where they needed to go. And I want to double click a little bit on your earlier point around the difference between cooperation and collaboration, because for me, I think leaders are really, really great at getting teams to collaborate with each other, but that's a very different skill than cooperation. And I'm saying, oh, the two of you on the same project, you go forth and you go do the work together. So what's the difference
Yeah.
between the two, and what's the nuance?
So it's a great question, but for like when I think of cooperation, it's a lower level than collaboration, right?
Yeah.
So cooperation is when, as a leader, you're asking right people to come together and they're willing to share potentially information, but as needed,
Mm,
kind of a thing. It's almost like, you know what? Oh, you asked me for this. Yes, I'm going to share this report with you because you need it in order to do your work, right?
mm,
That's cooperation. Collaboration, I view as a more proactive approach, which is let me think through what you're trying to solve for, and let me think through what I deal with in my world and just share with you that information that you may not know about. You may not even know that you don't know about it, right? It's
Mm,
almost like that blind spot. And so true collaboration is, I think, the moment that we really put ourselves in the other person's shoes and are very generous with
mm,
the other. What can I do to help? Because certainly the person may not even know what they don't know, but you may have information that they may need to know that may trigger something ahead of the game, and that's true collaboration, right?
mm.
So it's that really trying to make sense of the other person's challenge, and really wanting to be very, again, generous with how you support them.
Bringing it back slightly to the HR leadership space, what I sometimes experience there is that there is a lot of domains and areas where, at best, you should be striving for cooperation because there's reasons for that, right? And then there's other areas where you should be investing the time and the energy and building the trust that can lead towards collaboration. But I think it's important to understand where the difference of the two lie. And almost you set up the relationship in a different way and you manage and maintain that relationship very differently.
Right. And I want to say, collaboration doesn't happen overnight, truly.
Agree.
It's an intentionality, and it's little things often, I would say, where, I talk a bit about this, that, we're constantly responding and engaging to people's outreaches to us, right, in the
Mm.
workplace. And it's those little moments of saying yes as opposed to, saying no or but, right, that creates, right. And so we almost have this, reciprocity that happens in the workplace. And I think that, moving away from this transactional mindset, right,
Yeah.
because that's cooperation, to collaboration, which is more transformational. And I really believe that organizationals can transform through relationships, right?
Mhm.
It's where people are just, they are responding and engaging positively to each other, right? They're giving each other feedback. So everybody can grow. I think learning how to have productive conflict, right? And
Yeah.
seeing conflict
Love
is
that.
essential, right? Because conflict is actually how we grow, right? Whether it's
Mm.
inner conflict or conflict with someone else, like the thought that we're gonna see things the same way is a fantasy, right? And the
Mm.
opposite, it's like a good thing that we don't see things the same way, because it allows us to ultimately get to a better outcome, right?
Mm.
In the research, right? We've got really great research that shows that teams make better decisions than any one individual. Now, why
Yeah.
is that? It's because all of our minds work differently, and we're focused on different aspects of a problem naturally. And if we can work through the differences in how we see things to come at the best solution, that's the best. But certainly, if you have groups that come together to solve for a problem and they're afraid of conflict, that decision is not necessarily going to be the
No.
right one. It's the opposite, right? And so we need to learn how to embrace conflict, and make it, oftentimes it's about the problem and not about the person.
Yeah. And there's a couple of things I think, that I want to call out from what you've mentioned. The first one for
Yeah.
me is definitely on there is a leadership identity piece on who you are, what matters to you, what are your values, why you respond in particular ways. I think your point around conflict, good conflict, if I may call it that, only happens within the context of a good relationship of trust, because otherwise I think it does get personal. And I think people don't trust the intent behind, the conflict that we're trying to drive there. And then I think also on the other side to look at that in terms of saying if we are going to be working in organizations where relationship driven leadership is an important aspect for us, and I firmly believe there's the formal organization and then there's the real way that the organization works. It does sound a little bit like culture work that we're also starting to get into here, into it as well, right? And I would love to hear your
Yes.
thoughts on how does this
Yeah.
link through into culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting. Just because you hold a certain role doesn't mean that you have the influence that you need. And we see that all the time, right? There are these networks, and that's what you're talking about, I think, Dieter, when you're talking about,
Mm,
right? There's the formal organization, but then there's the way things really work. And that there are these influence networks that happen
yeah.
within organizations that have really, they don't have as much to do with position and role per se as they do around a lot of other variables. For example, how long the person has been in the organization and their connection to other influencers in the
Mm.
organization. And it's all about, right. So at the end of the day, though, culture is about values. They're
Hmm.
synonymous in many ways. And so the values that are actually walked, right? It's like walking the talk, right? So if we talk about collaboration, for example, are we actually embodying collaboration, right?
Mm.
And obviously, we're talking broadly about organizations and organizational culture, but there are subcultures within organizations.
For me, it's also the fact that, whenever we think about topics like culture or employee engagement or experience, etc., I think there is a very strong cognitive component to it that people at times underestimate, right? So there's this: I want to decide to be here. I want to decide to contribute. I want to decide to be part of the solution if things are not going the way that I want them to. I decide how I respond in that type of moment as well. Of course, there's the emotive piece there in terms of, how does it make me feel? Does it motivate me? Does it not motivate me? But I think collectively the two needs to operate and work together. And I think then there's shared ownership as well. So, Karan, I want to shift a little bit to, and I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment, right? We've celebrated all the great parts of relationship driven leadership, and we've spoken about culture to a large way and to a large extent. What's the dark side of relationship based leadership? So what does the other side of that look like if we don't do it well?
Yeah, I mean, listen, many, unfortunately, right, there are cultures that are toxic, right?
Mm.
And we spend more time at work than we do with our families. So when we are in a workplace where relationships aren't valued and where people aren't intentionally taking time to be positive and building them, right? Where competition, let's say, where the
Mm.
competition inside rather than outside. That can be a big, big problem because we spend more time at work. We spend so much time at work. It can impact our health, our well being, right? Cortisol levels can rise. People do get sick by
Yeah.
being in circumstances where they feel gaslit, where they feel
Mm.
disrespected. And so the dark side of a culture that does not value relationship, that does not value humanity is dire.
Mm.
Unfortunately, it truly is. Um, and then there's the opposite, another opposite end too, which I want to which I want to daylight, which is a culture which focuses on niceties all the time
Spot on.
and we have and forgets about accountability, right?
Mm.
Where you have that as well. And I've seen businesses go underwater as well because people were too afraid to hold others accountable, and relationship and the focus on relationship was so strong that people lost sight of the business and the business
Mhm.
needs.
Yeah. No, and I think that second one for me in a strange way, is almost the silent killer, if I can call it that, right? I think the first one with toxic leadership and toxic
Really.
cultures, people know, we kind of know that there's, the risks that we face, and it's bad for mental health, for emotional health, it's very bad for physical well-being as well. But I've also been in environments where almost the second one that you described is true, where we are so strongly relationship driven and relationship based that we don't hold people accountable, and there's always excuses and defensiveness almost in that culture as well, to say, but yeah, remember, Dieter is the following things, and that is why we cannot expect X, Y, and Z as part of that. Karen, before I start wrapping up for us, if I'm an HR leader or I'm somebody that works with the leaders in organizations, and I want to make the case for them around becoming more relationship driven, what would your advice be for that conversation?
Yeah, no, more the relation. It starts, as I said, with very small steps, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't have to be these grand gestures of, having lunch even with somebody. If you feel like you don't know the person enough, it could mean, stopping by someone's cubicle and just actually asking, how was your weekend, right? Learning one
Mm.
thing about them and then following up a couple of weeks later. Hey, I know that you like going hiking. Did you go hiking this week? Any interesting hikes recently? It's little things often, and it's
Mm.
remembering what people tell you and circling back around it, because what's not relationship, driven leadership is forgetting what the person has said.
Yeah.
That's even worse, right?
Yeah.
And so it's making a note of it. So it's getting to know people for who they are. It's, and you get to know people on a more superficial level, and then a more a deeper level by figuring out, how did the person end up coming to do what they do.
Karen, I think a couple of things that's definitely stood out for me from our conversation is the importance of being a relationship driven leader in a world that's dealing with a lot of complexity and a lot of change and a lot of uncertainty. And I love the fact that you spoke about and broke it down into connection, appreciation, collaboration, and support in both the, can I say, the tough times, but also in sharing in the wins and the spoils of when things are going really well. We spoke about the community aspect, about don't lead in isolation, lead through community, find your people that's going to get you there and support you. And we also touched a little bit on what's the dark side of building relationships in terms of the lack of accountability, and putting that into the context that being relationship driven is about seeing the human being, but also on the other side, knowing what the business impact is going to be and balancing those two, often at times which people perceive incorrectly as conflicting priorities. So, Karen, from my side, love the
Thank
conversation with
you.
you. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Where can people follow your work and where can they get a hold of your book?
Yeah, no, that's great. They can go to the relationshipdrivenleader.com. They
Mhm.
can go to karenbridboard.com, and book is on Amazon, and through your bookstore.
Thank you so much, Karen. And for everyone listening, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of the HR Dialogues. We will see you soon. Bye bye.